A homemade solution is rarely as good as something made by a professional. Sure, your haphazard creation of something that kind of works might hold up for a while, but as soon as it faces a problem, it falls apart and your tank gets blown to pieces. Hold on a second, you don't have any tanks, but Russia does. Thousands of them, in fact, and the country's troops have been improvising shoddy armor to protect those tanks in the absence of professionally made armor. It's working out about as well as you might expect. Worse even, as Russia's makeshift solutions are turning against it. Russian tanks are getting killed by their own armor, and you won't believe how. It all comes down to something that Russian soldiers have been making ever since Ukraine's drones started destroying their tanks by the thousands: cope cages. Russia has been using cope cages for much of the Ukraine war as it tries to deal with Ukraine's drone assaults. Wes O'Donnell provided the basics of how these improvised tank defenses are supposed to work in a Medium article, where he pointed out that tanks often have weak points on top, especially around the turret area, that a particularly accurate weapon can exploit. Many modern anti-tank missiles, such as the Western-made Javelin, can exploit these weaknesses by penetrating a tank's armor from the top. However, Ukraine's kamikaze drones are far cheaper than these advanced missiles and get the same results, making them a major problem for Russia's mechanized units. Cope cages are supposed to offer a solution because they're placed on top of tanks to force incoming projectiles to explode before they reach the tank itself. As O'Donnell puts it, as you might imagine, all the armor thickness in the world can't save you when the explosive payload finds its way inside the tank from an open hatch. Cope cages are a way to prevent gravity-assisted, drone-dropped grenades from exploiting this weakness. We've seen plenty of examples of these improvised defenses in Ukraine, ranging from literal cages built using wire mesh and placed over a tank's turret to wooden logs strapped onto tanks and armored vehicles. These cope cages have had mixed results. They rarely stop Ukraine's drones for long, often only forcing Ukraine to attack a tank several times before taking it out. But they're needed because Russia isn't providing the reactive armor its tank operators need to protect their vehicles. More on that later. In Russia, these cope cages are known as Tsar mangles, and Ukraine has often mocked them. The armorer's bench notes that Russia has gone so far with these improvised defenses to create what the outlet calls turtle tanks that bear very little resemblance to what a tank is supposed to look like. That's okay for Russia. If a Tsar mangle protects the tank from Ukraine's drones, then the tank can be used as part of mechanized assaults that get Russia's forces closer to their objectives. But it's here where we start to see the problem. As effective or otherwise as Tsar mangles may be at stopping drones, these forms of improvised armor are doing something that Russia never expected them to do: destroy the transmissions of the tanks to which they are attached. On November 9th, Militani reported on an interview conducted by tank historian Andriy Tarasenko with an unnamed Russian tanker. That tanker revealed that when crews mount their Tsar mangles directly onto their tank's turrets, a whole host of problems emerge. The chassis survives, but the transmission and side gearboxes don't, the tanker told Tarasenko. He then added, in another company they made a Tsar mangle out of cables. It didn't even make it 10 kilometers before one of the side gearboxes failed. The load on the components is very high and they fail much faster. And if you mount the mangle on the turret instead of the hull, the turret drives burn out. You can forget about manual rotation. In an effort to protect their tanks, Russia's soldiers are killing them. For those who might need context, a vehicle's transmission transfers power from that vehicle's engine to its wheels, or in a tank's case, its tracks. Every vehicle has one, and its essential nature is obvious due to the simple fact: a burnt-out transmission means the vehicle can't move. That's what Russia is doing to its tanks, the Russian tanker reveals. So desperate are its crews to avoid the horrors of Ukraine's drones that they're compromising their tanks just for a chance to protect them against the explosives that come from above. Of course, the Tsar mangles used to provide this protection aren't doing much to help. If a tank is forced to grind to a halt because its transmission is shot, that tank is done for. Russia can't use it anymore. The crew would have to abandon the tank, making them vulnerable to Ukraine's drones because they no longer have any armor at all. As for the tank itself, Ukraine doesn't even have to destroy it. The tank is already dead, and no Russian crews are going to risk trying to repair transmissions when drones are flying overhead. This seems like absolute insanity on the part of Russia's tank operators. However, there is a big reason why those operators are essentially killing their own tanks, and that reason is an indictment of how poorly Russia equips its soldiers. Most of Russia's tanks are no longer equipped with the explosive reactive armor that, assuming it functions correctly, should be able to stop Ukraine's anti-tank missiles and drones. The tanker who spoke to Tarasenko explains more. "Oh, with the reactive armor, a complete mess. On older vehicles it was a bit easier, although there was already a shortage of blocks, then of plastic explosives. That didn't stop me. We reinforced the gunner's side with 2 layers, welded a second layer onto the turret, and installed the screens, the tanker explains, suggesting that Russia at least used to provide enough reactive armor for partial protection. But now, not so much. But on the BVMs, all those relics they show apparently only exist in Kremlin cartoons. On the turret cheeks, there's a homemade version from garage workshops, sheet metal shaped like factory plating with an explosive insert from the UR-77 mine-clearing charge. It works about 50-50 at a 45-degree angle, the tanker says. The 2 takeaways here are damning. First, Russia's tank operators are being forced to improvise and build their own reactive armor blocks for their tanks. Militani says this practice began in June 2024, and it sees Russia's forces creating their own armor blocks in field workshops that they're creating on the battlefield. It's almost admirable. Essentially working out of the equivalent of garages, Russians are packing the explosive materials from UR-77 mine-clearing charges into containers they find or make themselves and strapping them to their tanks. As the operator points out, this is far from a perfect solution. This improvised armor only works half the time at a specific angle, but it's at least better than nothing. The big problem, as Militani points out, is that precise matching of materials is needed to make reactive armor work. When that precision isn't available, as is the case with the makeshift reactive armor Russia's forces are making, you get blocks that don't always explode. Then there's the actual reactive armor issue. Russia doesn't have enough of it, and this is hardly a new issue. Explosive reactive armor is actually a clever technology when it's used correctly. The idea is essentially to fight fire with fire, as SOFREP explains. The boxes that make up reactive armor are packed with explosives that detonate upon contact with something like an anti-tank missile or drone. These explosive blocks of armor are multi-layered, with the first layer dealing out the blast and the second directing the explosion away. The idea is that the armor absorbs and deflects the blast away from the tank itself. It's a very similar concept to a cope cage, only it's far more professional. Russia should be equipping all of its tanks with reactive armor, but it simply isn't able to. That's why we're seeing such improvisation now. However, even the reactive armor that Russia builds professionally may not be all that it's supposed to be. As impressive as this armor sounds on paper, it's been experiencing problems from almost the moment the war started. In August 2022, Forces News said that Russia was starting to lose a lot of its main battle tanks because the reactive armor with which they were equipped wasn't sufficient. Part of the reason why is that much of the armor being deployed was decades old, with some of it dating back to the First Chechen War, which began in 1994. In a situation where reliability is key, nearly 30-year-old armor likely isn't what Russian tankers wanted to see on their vehicles. More worrying for Russia and its tanks was the military's inability to use and install this armor correctly. The UK's Ministry of Defence highlighted this in an August 2022 X post, where it said, "It's highly likely that many Russian tank crews lack the training to maintain era, leading to either poor fitting of the explosive elements or it being left off entirely. A lack of reactive armor is one thing. Leaving it off is better than installing it incorrectly. It's those who tried and failed to install that were causing problems for their own tanks. We mentioned earlier that reactive armor is layered, with the first layer generating a blast and the second layer deflecting the blast away. Now imagine what happens if the armor is installed incorrectly and there are gaps between the blocks, for instance. Suddenly, the deflecting layer is far less effective, meaning Russia's tanks have to absorb even stronger explosions. As the UK Ministry of Defence puts it, these deficiencies probably contribute to widespread incidents of turret ejection, which are well documented in eyewitness videos from Ukraine. It's almost like Russia's tankers are stuck in a catch-22 situation. As ridiculous as it may seem that Russia's Tsar Mangals are contributing to the destruction of tanks by burning out their transmissions, the alternative doesn't seem much better. A lack of training means that the reactive armor that's supposed to protect those tanks isn't doing its job. What would you prefer as a tanker? Armor that kills your tank, and likely you as well, because it isn't working properly, or a cope cage that will disable your tank, but at least leaves you with a sliver of a chance to escape? Neither option is desirable, but the second is better than the first. That seems to be the conclusion that Russia's tankers have come to, and there is another potential reason why. A slightly higher chance of surviving is good. Even better is that tanks equipped with Tsar Mangals can still move until their transmissions burn out. According to Euromaidan Press, that's another reason to avoid poorly installed reactive armor. If Russia is at least able to get its tanks and their improvised armor a couple of miles closer to Ukraine's defenses, then as far as Putin is concerned, the tank has still done its job. If that tank gets close enough to fire on Ukraine, then even better. It doesn't matter that the tank is a sitting duck that will likely quickly be destroyed once it's discovered. The fact that it can rattle off a few shells before the inevitable buzzing of drones overhead is heard is enough for Putin. That sums up his approach to the Ukraine war in a nutshell. He simply doesn't care how much of Russia's equipment he loses or how many of Russia's soldiers die, as long as some damage is done to Ukraine in the bargain. So Russia's tanks are being killed by the makeshift armor that their operators create. Before, they were being killed by the armor that the Russian military provided. What does all of this mean for Russia? The one thing that is as clear as day is that tanks aren't evolving anywhere near quickly enough to be the difference makers on the Ukraine battlefield that Putin expected them to be. The supposed special military operation was never meant to last this long. As the Kyiv Independent reported in September 2022, Russia was believed to have 3,330 operational tanks at the time of the Ukraine invasion. As of September 2022, the country had lost at least 994 of those tanks, accounting for about 30% of its operational fleet, and it would soon lose even more. It wasn't long before Russia was pulling from its reserves, but the tanks that followed those that Russia initially sent to Ukraine were often older and in poor condition compared to the first wave of tanks. And once drones became the focal points of the war, tanks almost faded into the background. The weapon that Putin thought would steamroll Ukraine failed, and Russia still hasn't found a way to make its tanks as effective as it initially believed they would be. Euromaidan Press highlights this fact, noting that the tanks were often at the forefront of Russia's assaults on Ukraine's positions, especially during the first few years of the war. Tanks led massive mechanized assaults, and they were meant to absorb drone strikes with their armor. We see how well that armor has been working. Ultimately, Russia has fallen back on sacrificing its tanks to deplete Ukraine's ammunition and drone stockpiles, which is far from their intended purpose. This is also a strategy that can't last for much longer, as Euromaidan Press notes. The Russians cannot keep sacrificing tanks forever. The Kremlin may be desperate enough for usable armor to pull old T-64s out of storage and try to make them work. Alternatively, the Russians could continue to rely on infantry offensives in the short term to buy more time for their mechanized forces to recover, it said on November 10th. We'll come back to that point in a moment. On the evolution front, Russia is trying to come up with other solutions. Reactive armor isn't working, whether that be due to the age of the armor or the inability of Russia's forces to install it properly. As crazy as it sounds, Tsar mangles are working better, though they're destroying tank transmissions. With neither of these solutions being viable for the long term, Russia is trying out something else: foldable screens. In its report on how Russian cope cages are killing the country's tanks, United 24 Media points out that Russia has patented a foldable anti-drone screen that bears a striking resemblance to the improvised hood armor that Ukraine has been using to defend against Russia's drones and other loitering munitions. As we've seen so many times during the Ukraine war, Russia is making up for its own absence of original ideas by stealing from Ukraine and calling it innovation. The same outlet provided more details on the patent in July report. It says that Russia's Karbyshev Military Engineering Academy registered the patent, with the design it created essentially being a carbon copy of Ukraine's hoods. The new armor features a modular frame, making it adaptable for all types of tanks, and a metal mesh cover that's supposed to stop drones in their tracks. Apparently, the new system is between 1.2 and 1.5 times more effective at stopping Ukraine's drones than the alternatives that Russia is fielding. But there's no information about how heavy these collapsible cope cages are. If they weigh as much as the Tsar mangles that Russian forces are already using, they're going to be just as damaging to tank transmissions. Russia will be back to square one. And it doesn't have much more time to come up with a solution to the drone problem before it runs out of tanks altogether. The National Interest said as much in an October 9th article where it posed the key question: what happened to all of Russia's tanks? We have a few answers already, as a combination of anti-tank weapons, drones, and Russian incompetence is killing those tanks. But the main takeaway from this article is just how dire Russia's tank situation has become after almost 4 years of war with Ukraine. The article builds on the figures from the Kyiv Independent that we shared earlier. It says that by 2020, Russia had reduced its former Soviet-era fleet of 64,000 tanks to around 12,000. About a third of those tanks were operational, as the Kyiv Independent reported, with the rest being in storage. Russia still had massive strength in numbers. A fleet of 12,000 tanks is about double what the US military has, the outlet notes. But that fleet is practically gone. Recent open-source intelligence suggested that Russia has only 2,887 tanks in storage today, and more than half of these are in poor condition, the National Interest says. Less than 1/4 could be classified as being usable on the battlefield. Fewer than 100 were the relatively modern T-80 MBTs, with the remainder including antiquated T-62, T-64, and early model T-72 tanks. So Russia's reality becomes clear. A quarter of 2,887 is a little over 721, and that's how many tanks Russia has left that are ready to go. It's building more in limited quantities, and it could still repair some of those that are in poor condition, but the country is running out fast. Tanks being killed by Tsar mangles isn't helping matters. Even if those tanks at least move Russian forces a few miles forward, Russia has only captured about 20% of Ukraine since February 2022, and the other 80% isn't going to fall to a tank fleet that's being halted by the very defenses Russia is hoping will stop Ukraine's drones. Whatever Russia has planned next for its tank armor is going to be too little, too late. And that's the case for the most modern armor that Russia supposedly has to offer. The country has something that's meant to work better than any of the makeshift solutions or reactive armor that failed so hard in Ukraine. It's called Arena M, and it's meant to be capable of destroying drones by the hundreds. But this invincible tank armor is already being obliterated by Ukraine, making it as worthless as the cope cages that are killing Russia's tanks. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show if you want to see more videos covering the latest Russian military failings. And thank you for watching.